That leads really to the last point I want to make, was about Asian architecture. I do think that this is bigger than just a China story. And part of the challenge the United States has is that Asia is changing in very important, dynamic, and fundamental ways. And the region that it's going to confront us in 2025 will look very different from the region in 2015, much less 2005. And it will be difficult to rewind the clock back to 1985, given what's happened, particularly in the economic space in this region. And the three issues I'd flag for you: one, as I said, the collision between economics and security. In the security realm, the United States has exercised leadership in Asia because it has been a provider of both security-related public goods and economic-related public goods in this part of the world. And in the security space, until China and Japan have a Franco-German moment, which is not on the horizon, the United States was, is, and as far as the eye can see, will continue to be an important provider of security-related public goods for this region. Through alliances, forward-deployed military presence, there are challenges making the right kinds of investments in our posture, in forces, in weapons and technologies, adapting to change. But in the economic sphere, there is no scenario under which the United States continues to play a role analogous to the one that it did in the 1960s or the 1970s. In trade, for instance, US trade with every country in Asia is increasing in absolute terms, but declining in relative terms. And the United States' role as a source of final demand on which export-led economies could essentially power their way to growth, a lot is going to change because Asian economies increasingly provide economic public goods to one another. And at a time when the tools of economic statecraft are under attack from both left and right in the United States, not just TPP, but the whole mix of tools, that's a challenge that the United States faces because, and this gets to my last point, the story of change in Asia is not just a China story. When you talk about architecture in the panel, I hope we recognize that the story of Asian architecture did not start in Beijing. It didn't spring from the head necessarily of Xi Jinping. China is trying to leverage many of these trends to its strategic and economic advantage. But in the 1990s, after all, it was Japanese bureaucrats, not Chinese, who came up with the idea of Asian Monetary Fund that didn't include the United States. Asia-only trade agreements, bond funds, swap agreements. This incipient Asian regionalism that the United States in the 1990s chose to squash would be much harder to do today under prevailing circumstances. So some Asian institutions that do not include the United States will advance, I would argue, regardless of American views and preferences. And what's more, Asia is becoming integrated, East, Central, and South, in ways that are going to change the map of the region. It will be more Asian than Asia Pacific, more continental than subcontinental, as East and South Asia become more strategically and economically intertwined. And its continental West, more Central Asian than Eurasian, as these former Soviet countries discover their Asian roots and become linked not just by Chinese capital, but Japanese capital, Korean capital, and so on. And the United States needs to think hard and strategically about how to position itself to maximum strategic and economic advantage in that new Asia. And this is something I've written and talked a lot about, and we can talk about it if there's time for Q&A. But why don't I stop there, and I hope that gave you some things to chew on. Thanks.